Have you ever felt lost, not in a forest or a city, but in the very current of your own life, carried somewhere you never intended to go? The ancient Greeks knew this feeling deeply, and they whispered of a man who understood it better than any soul who ever drew breath. His name has echoed for 3,000 years across marble temples and moonlit waters, and his story begins not with triumph, but with a ship swallowed by darkness, a man weeping on a distant shore, longing for something as simple as home. There are monsters ahead, some with teeth, some with beautiful voices, some that wear the face of forgetting itself. There is a sea the color of bruised wine, and a journey that will ask everything of one mortal heart. Gods will meddle. Temptation will bloom like flowers that steal the mind, and memory, that most fragile of anchors, will be all that keeps him human. Welcome to the story of the Odyssey. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. The Aegean lay flat and burning, its surface the deep reddish bronze of an old shield left in the sun too long. No land interrupted the horizon. No sail cut the light. The air smelled of brine and warm stone, and the last heat of the day pressed down like a hand. Somewhere beyond that burnished edge of water, a man waited, and somewhere further still, a home waited for him. The man who waited was named Odysseus. He sat on a salt-bleached outcrop at the western edge of the island, knees drawn to his chest, face turned toward the water. Every evening he came here. Every evening he wept, not quietly. His shoulders shook, and the breath left him in ragged pools, and the tears cut through the grime on his cheeks and dripped from his jaw onto the stone. The rock beneath him was warm still, holding the day's heat in its gray surface. His hands lay open in his lap, empty. The greatest mind that had ever planned a war, open and empty, unable to plan a single step home. That night, Calypso came to him inside the cave. She moved through the hanging wisteria, the purple clusters brushing her shoulder, releasing their faint, sugared scent into the firelit air. And she stood before him with her hands open at her sides. "Stay," she said. "I will make you immortal. You will never age, never lose another man, never grieve." The fire popped once. Odysseus looked at her, her silver armlets, her saffron linen, her face that would never change, and felt the full weight of what she was offering pressed down against his sternum like a hand. He said no, not cruelly, not easily. He chose gray-haired Penelope and the limestone hills of a small island that smelled of goat and brine and thyme. He chose ending, and the word sat between them in the warm cave, solid and irrevocable. Calypso did not move away. She stood where the offer still hung in the air, and she asked him, quietly, without bitterness, how he could choose a woman who would wrinkle and slow and one day stop. Odysseus looked down at his own hands, rope-scarred, salt-cracked, the knuckle of the left ring finger crooked from an old break. "Because she is mine," he said, "and I am hers. And that is a thing that does not require forever to be true." Calypso said nothing. The fire settled, a soft collapse of cedar into ash, and the cave grew dimmer by one small degree. Far from that dimming cave, on Olympus, Athena rose. She stood before her father's throne, gold underfoot, gold overhead, the air carrying the faint sweetness of ambrosia and warm stone. And she did not ask. She stated, "A pious man," she said, "who gave smoke and sacrifice and honor, left to rot on an island, while the god who hated him visited distant feasts." Zeus listened. His great hands rested open on his knees. When Athena finished, the hall held only the low hum of light that never changes and never dims. Zeus nodded once. That was enough. The fate of Odysseus turned on that single unhurried motion. At Zeus's nod, Hermes moved. He laced his golden sandals tight, the tiny wings at each ankle flexing once, twice, and dropped from Olympus into the bright morning air above the sea. He skimmed low, close enough that the white crests of the swells wet the soles of his feet, cutting across the water in long, arcing lines. The salt smell rose sharp and cold. Below him, the Aegean rolled in long ridges of deep blue-green. Ogygia appeared on the horizon as a dark shape, then a tree line, then a shore of pale rock. Hermes landed on the beach, the wings stilled. The island, which had not changed in 7 years, received the one thing it could not refuse, a message that could not be undelivered. Calypso was at her loom when Hermes found her. She turned before he spoke. She knew the winged sandals on her stone floor, knew what a herald's arrival meant. Hermes delivered the words cleanly, without cruelty. Zeus commanded, Odysseus would sail. She was quiet a long moment. Then, you gods begrudge us this. Every time a goddess loves a mortal man, you take him. Her voice did not shake. That was worse. I love him. I saved him. And still you come with your orders. Hermes held her gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Calypso smoothed the unfinished weaving with one flat palm, feeling the resistance of the threads beneath her hand, and said simply, I will tell him. By the following morning, Odysseus held an axe. Calypso had led him to the ridge where the tallest trees stood, cedars and silver fir, their trunks straight as spear shafts, their bark rough and resinous beneath his palm. She pointed, said nothing, and left him there. He swung. The blade bit deep, and the shock of it ran up both forearms into his shoulders, a feeling he had not felt in 7 years. Cedar chips, pale and damp, scattered across his sandals. The forest smelled of cut wood and cold morning air, sharp in the back of the throat. He felled 20 trees before midday, shaped them, notched them, lashed them with hemp rope until his hands bled at the knuckles. Each blow landed him somewhere closer to Ithaca. "4 days after the first axe blow, Odysseus raised the sail. The linen caught, filled, and the raft lurched forward, a pull in the chest, sudden and animal. Ogygia fell behind him, its dark green ridgeline shrinking against the pink dawn sky until it was no wider than a finger held at arm's length. Then it was gone. He fixed the bear on his left hand and Orion's belt on his right, as Calypso had told him, "Steer by those, keep the cold at your shoulder, and the sea will carry you east." The cedar planks flexed beneath his feet. Salt spray broke across his knuckles. Ahead, nothing but open water and the slow brightening of a world that did not yet know he was coming. "7 days out, Poseidon came home from the Ethiopians. He crossed the high air above the Aegean, and his shadow fell on the water far below. And there, crossing the gray-green open sea, was a shape no larger than a splinter. He stopped. The anger that had lived in him for 10 years rose through his chest like a tide finding a crack in stone. His knuckles whitened around the trident's shaft, cold bronze, heavier than a ship's anchor, trembling with what he was about to do. He raised it. The sky went black at the edges first. The black reached the center of the sky between one breath and the next. The first wave struck the raft broadside, a wall of dark water, and the cedar planks lurched sideways, throwing Odysseus onto one knee. He grabbed the mast with both hands, fingers digging into rough-lashed rope, shoulders wrenched hard. A second wave came before the first had passed. Then a third. The sea had no direction anymore, only weight and noise, the deep, hollow roar of water folding over itself in the dark. Then the mountain came. Odysseus felt it before he saw it, a swell rising beneath the raft, lifting the whole platform like something weightless, tilting it further, and then the raft was vertical and he was falling through black air, and the cold hit him like a flat stone across his entire body. Under, dark, no surface visible. He kicked upward, had to be upward, lungs already burning. Salt pressed into his eyes, his nose, his open mouth. His hands found nothing. The raft was gone. The stars were gone. Ithaca was a word he could no longer locate in any direction. Many storms later, the ships made landfall on a low coast where the grass grew thick to the waterline and white flowers nodded in warm, windless air, the sweet, faintly fermented scent of something between honey and overripe fig rising off the meadow. Odysseus sent 3 men ashore to learn what land this was. They did not return. He found them lying in the grass, each with a half-eaten blossom loose in his fingers, their faces slack with a contentment so complete it looked like sleep. The gentle people of that coast stood nearby, offering more flowers with open hands, unhurried, smiling. Odysseus grabbed the nearest man by both arms and pulled. The man wept, not from pain, not from fear, but the way a child weeps when carried from somewhere warm. He had forgotten the ship, forgotten his wife's name, forgotten there was anything to return to at all. Odysseus dragged all 3 back across the wet grass, their heels cutting dark furrows, and bound them beneath the rowing benches. Then he ordered every oar into the water before anyone else stepped ashore. Three days on, the ships rounded a headland and found a sheltered island. Wild goats moving through dark cypress stands, the sharp green smell of bruised juniper underfoot, where the crews beached the hulls. Across a narrow strait, a larger shore rose in stepped cliffs and deep-mouthed caves. Enormous shapes moved on that hillside among pale flocks. Odysseus stood at the water's edge and looked. Mud at his feet held the pressed outline of a footprint 4 times the length of his own. He knew then the size of whatever tended those sheep. Still, he chose 12 men and went. The cave came alive before Polyphemus entered it. His flock pushed through first. The dry lanolin smell of packed wool, the knock of hooves on stone, and then he ducked through the entrance, a pine trunk balanced across one shoulder, firelight catching the single eye above the bridge of his nose. He dropped the pine. The crack of it against the cave floor drove the air from every chest. Then the boulder. He set his back to it and pushed, and the grinding of that stone against the rock wall went on for a long time before the opening disappeared. He hadn't looked yet. He built his fire higher, turned, and found them. No sound left him. He simply reached into the shadows and took 2 men by the ankle, and what he did next was quick and without ceremony. And when it was finished, he ate, and the fire went on burning. After, Polyphemus slept. The sound of him was enormous, a slow, wet rasp that filled the cave the way water fills a hold. The fire had dropped to a sullen orange line along the lowest log. Odysseus had the knife out before he knew he'd reached for it. Bronze, warm from his own grip, lighter than it had any right to be given what it could do. He looked at the sleeping throat. Then he looked at the boulder. The weight of it registered in his own chest. Not a thought, but something felt along the ribs, a pressure without remedy. No 12 men, not 20, dead before morning, sealed in with what they'd done. He set the knife down on the stone floor. The small click of it was the hardest sound he had ever made. He sat back and began to think. By the time the fire had burned down to coals, Odysseus had found it, a length of olive wood, pale green-gray and as long as a ship's mast, left raw and unshaped against the cave wall. He worked at its tip with his knife for a long time, the shavings curling down onto the stone floor, smelling faintly of resin. Then he pressed the point into the coals until it glowed orange at the tip. When Polyphemus woke, he drank. Odysseus brought the bowl forward himself. Polyphemus drained it, and the wine was dark and thick and hit the giant the way a stone hits standing water, all at once. His single eye grew slow. "What is your name?" Polyphemus said. "Nobody," said Odysseus. "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus laughed, a low, wet rumble deep in his chest. He would eat nobody last, he said, and that was his gift. Then he lay down. Then he slept. The snoring stopped the moment the stake went in. 4 men drove it, shoulders locked, feet braced against the wet stone floor, and Odysseus threw his full weight behind them. The sharpened tip, still orange from the coals, entered with a hiss and a sound like green wood splitting. Polyphemus screamed. The cave walls held the sound and gave it back doubled. Outside, other Cyclopes stirred on the hillside, calling through stone, "Who hurt you? What is wrong?" "Nobody," Polyphemus roared. "Nobody is killing me." A pause, then their footsteps retreating. "If nobody hurts you," they said, "then pray to your father Poseidon." They left. Odysseus pressed his back against the cave wall, chest heaving, the stake still smoking in the dark. 6 of his men were already bones on the floor. He had saved the rest with a single invented word. He held both of those things at once, the word that worked and what it had cost to need it. By the time the ship cleared the rocks, the oars were slick with sweat, and no one spoke. Odysseus stood at the stern and watched the cliffs shrink. The gray-pink light was coming up behind the island, cold against his face, smelling of salt and scorched wood still clinging to his chiton. His men pulled hard. They did not look back. He looked back. The giant was on the cliff top, roaring at the sound of the oars, tearing loose a boulder and hurling it blind into the pale water ahead of them. The wave it raised lifted the stern and dropped it, a blow through the hull's floor and up through every man's feet. Still, Odysseus said nothing. He gripped the stern rail, knuckles whitening against the wet wood. Then he shouted, "Cyclops, it was no nobody who blinded you. It was Odysseus, son of Laertes, of Ithaca." His men grabbed his arms, begging him to stop. He did not stop. On the cliff, Polyphemus went still for one breath. Then he raised his face toward the sky and called to Poseidon, his father, lord of every sea between Ithaca and here, and asked that Odysseus never reach home, or reach it late, alone, on a stranger's ship, to find nothing but grief. Below, the dark water received the prayer without a sound. Days later, the bronze walls of Aeolus's island rose from the water like a fist, hammered flat on top, smooth and sea-green, where the waves had worn them. Aeolus received Odysseus at his table, fed him for 9 days, and listened to every word of Troy. On the 10th morning, he brought out the bag, dark oxhide, thick as a man's palm, lashed at the neck with silver wire twisted into 3 tight loops, heavy enough that Odysseus felt it settle through his shoulders when Aeolus pressed it into his arms, a wet, inward weight, dense with something that moved without moving. Every contrary wind was inside it. Only the warm westerly ran free, filling the sail as they put out to sea. Ithaca appeared on the 3rd morning, the olive-gray shape of it unmistakable on the horizon, close enough to smell wood smoke. Odysseus slept. His men gathered at the bag where it sat lashed to the mast, whispering. "Treasure," they agreed. It had to be. They cut the silver wire. The sound the bag made was brief and absolute, a low tearing rush. And then every wind that had been sleeping inside it was loose at once, and the wood smoke smell was gone, and Ithaca was gone with it. Odysseus woke to the screaming. Not men, wind, the ropes singing at a pitch that meant something had broken loose, and the deck lurching beneath him before he had finished standing. He reached the prow in 4 steps, gripping the rail, salt spray hitting his face cold as iron. Ithaca was behind him now, growing smaller. He watched it go, the olive-gray shape he had smelled. Wood smoke, home, nearly his, shrinking until it was a line, then a shadow, then nothing at all. He sat down on the planking. The spray came over the rail and soaked through his chiton, and he did not move. Around him men shouted and pulled at useless oars. He heard none of it. He pressed one hand flat against the wet cedar deck and held it there. He did not speak for a very long time. Days later, Odysseus sent half his men into the forest. They found the palace before midday, polished white limestone rising between black fir trunks, its courtyard flagged with gray stone, still damp in the shadow of the trees. Mountain wolves and tawny lions moved through the outer yard, slow and quiet as house dogs. Then they heard the singing. It came from inside, low, unhurried, woven through the rhythmic clack of a loom. The woman at it had long, straight black hair and a deep purple chiton, and she did not stop weaving when they entered. She only smiled and invited them in. She was already tapping them before the last man cleared the threshold. Her carved staff, dark hardwood, gold-capped, touched each shoulder once. They dropped, not slowly. Between one breath and the next, bristled and hunched and forced to the cold stone on all fours, grunting in the mud of her courtyard. Circe moved among them, unhurried, refilling the trough. She did not look cruel. That was the worst of it. Their eyes, still human, still frightened, watched her from below the bristled brows, and she did not look down. Odysseus had not yet reached the palace gates. He stopped when the young man stepped onto the path, appearing simply between one heartbeat and the next, as though he had always been standing there. Sandy curls, golden sandals, the faint smell of cedar smoke, and salt air on a road that held neither. Hermes held out his hand. Resting on his palm was a small plant, its single stem no longer than a finger. The flower was white, the root black, not dark brown, not charcoal, but the absolute black of forged iron. It weighed almost nothing. That was the first strange thing. Odysseus took it. The root was cold. "Moly," Hermes said. Then he was gone. The path empty, the forest pressing close on both sides, cypress and mastic pine standing motionless in the midday heat. Odysseus looked down at the small white flower in his fist. It did not look like protection. It looked like something a child might pick without thinking and drop just as easily. He closed his fingers around it and walked forward. Inside the hall, Circe raised her carved staff and brought it down across his shoulders. Nothing happened. She struck again, the gold knob catching the torchlight, and Odysseus stood exactly as he had, feet on the stone floor, breathing. Her hand moved to his chiton. Her lips formed the words. Still nothing. Her face changed then. Not fear yet. Something before fear. The recognition that the room had shifted without her permission. Odysseus drew his sword. He pressed the blade flat against the soft hollow of her throat. Cold iron. She went very still, and her skin went white beneath it, and he watched her understand. For the first time in how long he could not guess that she was not the most dangerous thing in the room. "Swear," he said. She swore. By the following morning, Circe led him across the dewy courtyard to the far edge of the grounds, where the low pigsty stood in the shadow of a cedar wall. She knelt beside the first animal without ceremony, opened a clay jar, and worked the salve into the bristled hide with both hands. The pig shuddered. The shuddering spread along the spine, down the legs, and then Eurylochus was standing there, blinking, skin pink and new, younger than Odysseus remembered. Circe moved to the next. One by one they rose. Some of them wept before they understood why. Odysseus stepped forward and caught the nearest man by the shoulders, and the man gripped back hard enough to bruise. They held each other in the smell of cedar and damp earth, while the others found their feet around them. But Odysseus counted. He had always counted. And when the pigsty stood empty and the last jar was sealed, the number was wrong. Not all of them had been changed into pigs. Some had simply been gone when his men reached the palace, taken differently, or not taken at all, walked into the forest, and not returned. He did not say their names aloud. He stood with the living men pressing close around him, warm and breathing, and held the missing ones in silence. A year passed on Aeaea before Odysseus turned his men toward the sea again. On the last night, the young sailor Elpenor climbed to the roof to sleep. The hall was warm with wine and bodies, and he wanted the cool dark above it all. He lay down on the flat stones and slept deeply. Before first light, Odysseus roused the men. Elpenor heard it in his sleep, distant voices, the scrape of oars being dragged, and came up too fast, stepped wrong at the roof's edge, and fell. The sound his body made on the courtyard stones was brief. One wet, percussive impact. Then nothing. They were already moving. The ships needed the tide. No one had time to dig, and no one knew to look. Odysseus carried that sound with him onto the water, not yet knowing its source, not yet knowing the name that went with it. The grief arrived later when he learned what had made it. By the time the gray shore appeared, the oars had gone silent on their own. No one called the stroke. The men simply stopped, and the hull slid forward on water that made no sound against the planks. No slap, no push, no give. The sea here did not move so much as wait. Odysseus stepped off the bow into shallow water, cold enough to ache at the shin bone, and felt the sand beneath, fine, packed gray grit that held his footprint without releasing it. Behind him, his men pulled cloaks tight at the throat. None of them looked toward the leafless trees at the shore's edge, the pale trunks standing without wind, without birdsong, without the creak of branch on branch. He reached into the ship and lifted the bronze-bladed mattock. It was heavy in both hands, heavier than it should have been. He walked up the shore alone, chose his ground, and began to dig. The trench was cut. Odysseus lifted the first black sheep by the throat and drew the blade across. The blood came fast, dark and steaming, and the smell of it, iron and salt and warm animal fat, rose into the cold gray air like nothing else in this country had. They came immediately. First, a young woman, moving without sound, her wedding clothes still on her. Then an old soldier, one arm held at a wrong angle. Then more, children, sailors, mothers, pressing forward through the pale trees, their mouths already open, reaching toward the trench where the only warm thing in the world was slowly going cold. Odysseus drew his sword and held them back. His arms shook. Then Achilles came. He moved through the gray crowd the way a blade moves through water, the others parting not from awe, but from something older than awe. He was tall, pale as river silt, the faint silver at his edges, the only light in that country. Odysseus told him he ruled here as a king among kings. Achilles was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has stopped pretending. "I would rather," he said, "be the lowest slave alive, working under a cruel master, owned, hungry, spent, than be king of every corpse in this place." Odysseus had no answer. He held his sword and said nothing. The trench cooled between them. Before the last echo of Achilles faded, Tiresias was already there. He had been waiting at the edge of the crowd, a small figure, bone-thin under a dark himation that had dried to the color of old ash. His clouded eyes found Odysseus without searching. He crouched at the trench's edge, lowered both hands into the dark red, and drank. Then he spoke. Poseidon's anger would follow every mile home. The men would not survive it. Odysseus would arrive alone on a stranger's ship to find his own hall full of men eating his food and competing for his wife. Violence waited inside those walls, but there was a way through. Leave the cattle of Helios on Thrinacia untouched. Keep your men from them. Do that, and you reach Ithaca. Fail, and you watch them drown, every last one, before you do. Tiresias stood, wiped both hands against his himation, and walked back into the gray crowd without looking back. Then she was there. Odysseus recognized her before he understood what he was seeing. The set of her shoulders, the way she held her hands loose at her sides, the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to wait. Anticlea, his mother. She drank from the trench and lifted her pale face toward him. She had not outlasted his absence. Grief had done what Troy could not. He reached for her. His arms closed on cold air. A breath of it faintly damp, carrying the smell of turned limestone and winter rain. He tried again, nothing. The third time his chest broke open around it. She watched him with something between tenderness and sorrow, holding both without resolving either. "This is the way of it," she said quietly. "The sinews no longer hold. You cannot keep what death has already taken." He stood with his arms still half raised. The gray crowd moved at the edge of his sight, indifferent. Days later, the sea was flat and bright. Odysseus had himself lashed to the mast with his own belt and 3 coils of hemp rope, tight enough that the fibers pressed ridges into his forearms. He had given the orders clearly, "Row harder if he commands them to stop." His men had packed beeswax into their ears, pressing it in with their thumbs until the world went muffled and dumb for them. Then the voices came, not screaming, not the shriek of something predatory. They sang of Troy, what he had not seen, which city fell after, which captain wept, what the gods decided in the moments between things. They sang of Ithaca, specific, exact. Every name he had been carrying for 10 years, spoken back to him perfectly. He screamed. He wrenched both shoulders forward against the rope. The hemp tore into the skin above his wrists, and he did not feel it. His men rowed harder. Beyond the sirens, the cliffs rose. Circe had told him exactly how it would happen. 6 men, 1 for each of her heads. "Accept it," she had said, "or lose the ship and every soul aboard." So when the hands came down, gray, long-fingered, faster than anything that size should move, Odysseus stood at the stern and kept his grip on the steering oar. The screaming was the worst part, not the dying. They called his name on the way up. 6 voices, each one a man he knew, still reaching toward him as the rock swallowed them. His knuckles were white on the oar. The ship passed through. He had saved 42 men by watching 6 of his own disappear into the dark above, and he stood at the stern and could not decide what that made him, and the oar was smooth and warm under his hands. And the sea opened ahead, indifferent and wide. By the time Thrinacia rose from the water, the oars were heavy in exhausted hands. Odysseus beached the ship himself, driving the bow into dark sand with the last of the day's light burning orange across the hillside above. The cattle of Helios moved through the high grass up there, broad-backed, slow, their hides the color of heated bronze, fat, unhurried, magnificent. He made his men gather at the waterline and swear by sea and sky to leave them untouched. They swore. He watched their faces as they did it, hungry, hollowed eyes drifting up the hill, and he believed them, and he did not believe them, and both of those things were true at once. A month passed. The winds did not change. Odysseus woke to it before he understood it, the smell reaching him through sleep like a hand on his shoulder. Wood smoke, fat, the char of roasting meat. He ran. The sand was cold and wet under his feet, the fire already high, the smell of seared bronze-colored hide thick in the salt air. His men stood around the flames with the heavy stillness of men who have already chosen. He shouted. The sound left him raw. Not one of them moved to answer. Their eyes went sideways, down to the sand, anywhere but his face. And in that refusal, in the precise angle of 42 men looking away at once, he understood that no word he had, no cunning, no plan in any language could reach back across what they had already done. The fire crackled. Helios's cattle turned on the spit. It was done. Six days later, the winds returned. The men pulled the oars without speaking, their eyes forward, and the ship cleared Thrinacia's last black rock just before noon. Then the cloud came. It did not drift. It dropped, a single dark mass pressing down until the air smelled of hot iron and the sea flattened to black glass beneath it. The oars stopped. No one gave the order. The bolt hit the keel. The sound reached Odysseus before the light did, a wet, percussive crack that he felt climb from the soles of his feet up through his teeth. The hull opened beneath him. Men left the ship sideways, backwards, arms out, and the sea took them one and then another, and then all of them, their voices swallowed between one wave and the next. Odysseus caught a beam, both arms around it, cheek against the salt-soaked wood, the cold of the deep water pulling at his legs. Around him the ship continued to come apart, planks turning slowly, rope ends drifting down into the dark. He held on. He held on through the night. By dawn, the current had carried him somewhere green. The beam grounded on sand with a soft, grinding lurch, and the lurch moved through his ribs, through the locked muscles of his arms, into the bone. He let go. The sand was warm. Cedar-scented forest came down to the tide line, and somewhere above the canopy, a single bird called once and stopped. He lay face down on that shore until the sun had fully risen. Then he sat up, looked west toward nothing. He would sit in that same place every evening for 7 years, looking at the same empty horizon while the island stayed green and sweet-smelling and unchanged behind him. Now you understand the weeping. Far from that shore, in Ithaca, Telemachus stood in the doorway of his own great hall and watched three men hurl a sheep bone at the far wall for the entertainment of no one. Wine-dark stains mapped the stone floor. His father's amphorae, the good ones, sealed with pine pitch the year before the war, stood open and emptying. He was 20 years old. He had been watching this his whole life. The bones struck the wall. Laughter rose. Telemachus's jaw tightened one slow degree, and he did not look away. Something in his chest, long compressed, long held, moved. Upstairs, Penelope sat at her loom. The room held the smell of warm beeswax and the faintly sour tang of undyed wool. A single oil lamp burned low on the table beside her. She reached forward, found the loose thread at the hem of the shroud, and began to pull. The day's work came apart in her hands, slow, deliberate, strand by strand. She had done this for 3 years. Each unraveling bought another morning. Then the door opened. The suitor who entered was not unkind in his manner, which made it worse. He told her quietly that her maids had talked, that the hall knew, that the shroud must be finished now, and a husband chosen before the month turned. He left without waiting for her answer. Penelope sat very still. The half-unraveled cloth lay across her lap, pale gray threads loose against her dark peplos, light as cobweb, weightless as 3 years. Her fingers did not move. The lamp guttered once and steadied. Below, in the palace, the suitors feasted. Odysseus stood at the gate in the dark, wearing skin that was not his. Athena's work, a slow compression of years pressed into his face, his back curved, his hands roughened to leather. The rags smelled of salt and old wool. They were genuine rags, and they itched. Through the gate, torchlight spilled across the courtyard stones. He could hear the lyre, the laughter, the wet crack of a joint pulled from a roasting carcass. His carcass, his hall. He did not move for a long moment. Then he walked through the gate as a stranger, head down, shoulders bent, and the darkness of his own threshold closed around him. Just inside the gate, on a heap of dung and old straw, lay a dog. He was large once. The bones of his shoulders said so, and the length of his muzzle. Now his coat was matted gray-brown and dull, and his ribs rose and fell with the shallow, careful breathing of something that had been conserving warmth for a long time. Odysseus stopped walking. Argos lifted his head. The brown eyes found the bent figure in the rags, held there, and the tail moved once through the straw. Once, a slow, certain sweep, barely clearing the ground. He knew. Odysseus felt the knowing move through him like a hand pressing flat against his sternum. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He did not crouch. He did not reach down. Argos lowered his head onto his forepaws. His ribs rose once more, shallower than before. Then they did not rise again. Odysseus walked on into the torch-lit hall, head down, jaw set, and behind him the straw settled into the shape of a dog that was no longer breathing. That night, a servant came to find him. Penelope would speak with the beggar. The private room was small, lime-washed stone, a single oil lamp burning on an iron stand, its flame drawing a warm circle that barely reached the walls. She sat in a low cedarwood chair, her white peplos pooled at her feet, the ivory combs catching the light. Odysseus sat across from her and described a man he had once hosted in Crete, a broad-shouldered man with a purple wool cloak fastened at the throat with a gold brooch, a hound cast in relief holding a dappled fawn beneath its forepaws. Penelope went still. He kept his voice level and unhurried. He described the brooch's weight, its size. He had held it himself, he said, turned it over. She wept. The tears came quietly, not a collapse, but a slow unlocking, her chin lowering, her hands settling open in her lap. She wept for Odysseus, for the man who was not coming home. Odysseus watched her weep and did not move. The lamp flame was steady between them. He kept his face like stone, still, controlled, offering nothing, and felt the distance between two chairs become the longest journey he had ever made. Morning came, and Penelope made her decision. She carried the bow herself, no servant, no ceremony, down the stairs and into the hall where the suitors sat at their bread and wine. It was a composite bow, dark amber horn and sinew, recurved, longer than a man's arm, cold to the touch even in a warm room. She set it on the stone floor before them. The hall went quiet by degrees, cups lowered, chewing stopped, a bronze ladle set down against a bowl's rim with a soft, flat clink. She straightened and spoke. Whoever could string this bow and drive a single arrow clean through the ring holes of 12 axes set in a line would take her hand and the hall of Odysseus and Ithaca with it. Nobody moved. The bow lay on the stone, cold, dark, patient, and every man in that room understood. Before he reached for his wine or cleared his throat or looked at his neighbor, that he had never held anything like it. The first suitor to reach for it was Antinous, he who had eaten longest at that table. He braced the lower tip against his foot, bent his weight into the upper horn, and the bow did not move. His face darkened. He tried again, arms shaking, breath coming hard through his nose, and set it down before anyone could count how long he had struggled. The next man gripped it and could not bend it even to stringing position. Another oiled his hands with warm fat from the lamp's edge. The bow gave him nothing. They went through the hall one by one, broad men, young men, men who had laughed loudest and eaten most, and the dark amber horn defeated each of them completely. Some sat down quietly. One laughed, too high, too fast. The bow lay between attempts on the cold stone floor, patient and still, surrounded by men who had declared its owner dead for 3 years. Nobody strung it. In the corner, the beggar watched. Then the beggar rose. Some of the suitors laughed, a short, contemptuous sound. Others looked away, as though the old man's reaching for the bow was a small embarrassment no one needed to witness. But Penelope's voice cut across the hall. He would try. Her word settled the room. Odysseus took the bow. He turned it slowly in both hands, running one thumb along the inner curve of each horn, pressing lightly at the grip, tilting it toward the torchlight to sight along the length for any warp the years had pulled into the dark amber wood. He found the string. He checked its twist. Then he strung it. One motion. The horn bent, the loop seated, and it was done. He plucked the string once, lightly, with 2 fingers. The note it made was clean and high, a swallow's call, bright and short, and it hung in the air of the hall long after every voice had stopped. No one moved. Odysseus reached into the quiver. One arrow, iron-tipped, fletched with gray goose feathers, and knocked it without standing from his stool. He drew to his cheek. He breathed out. He loosed. The arrow passed through all 12 rings clean, iron singing once against iron at the far end of the row, and buried itself in the oak post behind them. Odysseus set the bow across his knees and looked at Telemachus. Telemachus stood up. He buckled the bronze sword at his hip, lifted his spear from against the wall, and crossed to the main doors. The boat dropped into its iron bracket with a sound like a stone into still water. Then Odysseus reached up and pulled the rags from his shoulders. Antinous never reached for his wine cup. The second arrow was already nocked before the first had finished its work, and it crossed the hall the way a thrown stone crosses. No ceremony, no pause. Then came the third, then the fourth. Odysseus did not stand until his quiver was nearly empty, and by then Telemachus was already moving through the smoke with the bronze sword swinging low. Two loyal servants entered at the far doors with iron spears. Together, the four of them worked the room from one end to the other, methodical, relentless, the way a farmer works a field that has gone too long to weeds. When the last man fell, the hall was quiet except for the fire. Penelope came down the stairs slowly. She had dressed. Her hair was pinned. She walked into the hall and looked at the man standing at its center. And she did not run to him. She sat. The silence between them was not cold. It was careful. She had unpicked too many fine-seeming things before. So she turned to the old nurse and said, in a voice like a woman ordering linen moved from one room to another, "Bring the marriage bed out here." Odysseus went still. Then his voice came up hard and disbelieving, because the bed could not be moved, had never been moved, was built around a living olive tree he had shaped himself with an adze and fitted into the floor of their room 20 years ago, its roots still reaching down through the stone. No one else knew that. Penelope's hands, folded in her lap, opened. His voice came quietly. He told her about the olive tree, how it had grown inside the future walls before there were walls, its trunk thick as a man's thigh, the bark silver green and cool to the touch, even in summer heat. How he had built the room around it, adzing the living wood into a bedpost, while the roots held fast in the earth beneath the stone floor. How the bed had never moved, could not move, was the room. Penelope crossed the floor. She pressed her face against the side of his neck, where 20 years of salt and sun had roughened the skin above the collarbone, and her hands found the back of his shoulders and held. He closed his arms around her. Neither of them spoke. The torches burned. Somewhere below, the roots of the olive tree reached through the dark stone, unchanged. The torches burned down to nothing. Outside, Ithaca breathed, the cold salt air moving through the fig trees on the hillside, the harbor water lapping at the stone wall below, a single goat shifting in the dark and settling again. The moon laid a pale road across the water and let it lie there, undisturbed. Inside the room built around a living tree, two people slept. The wine-dark sea was still.